We're really happy to have Monica Aufrecht with us today. She's a professor up at Bellevue College up in Bellevue, and she's a professor of philosophy. And some of the stuff that she teaches is philosophy of science and ethics. So, those are two subjects that are really important in our discussions about climate change. So, we're really thrilled to have you with us here, Monica. Thanks for joining in.
Happy to be here.
So let's just, let's see, just a little bit of your background. One of the things I can't help asking about, you attended Wellesley College back in Massachusetts. One of the advantages of being a host is I get to ask stuff that I'm interested in. So, what was it like going to Wellesley?
Oh, Wellesley's fantastic. Wellesley was just great. So I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and at the time, teenagers want to get as far away from home as they can. So that's as far as I could think of. And it was quite a culture shock. But Wellesley itself, really, I got to meet so many people from around the world and around the country, other students, and I learned a lot from them. It was a really great experience.
Yeah, looking back on my first college experience, which was the University of Oregon, I grew up in Oregon, so I didn't get to escape in the same kind of way you did. But it was culture shock for me, even just going to the University of Oregon, to find out that there was so much more to the world than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. So I can imagine, especially a sophisticated institution like Wellesley, and then all the way from Anchorage. I get that it would have been a culture shock. So, why did you pick philosophy? How'd you end up in philosophy?
So that I guess that is interesting. Um, it's not where I thought I was going to be. I started off in physics, which, if I think about it, why did I pick physics? Um, I loved it. I had a fantastic physics teacher. It was a lot of fun. And there's an interesting social justice aspect to it for me, of thinking about how can we make the world a better place. And so you might think, why physics of all things? Would you go there?
Yeah.
um, but I felt like as a youth, I wanted to divide the world into things we can change and things we can't. And I wanted to know what the difference is. I figured I'll study physics, I'll learn the things we can't change, the natural laws, and then we can move on to business. It's making people's lives better. And I got caught up there asking lots of questions.
Mm.
How do we know that? How did you draw that conclusion? What are the other alternative explanations? And I got gently nudged to philosophy classes
Mhm.
where those questions were welcomed and embraced and discussed in detail.
Yeah, I
And that's how
get
I found
that.
my home.
Yeah. So then from Wellesley, somewhere along the line, you ended up out here in the Pacific Northwest, the University of Washington. You got your PhD in philosophy from the University of Washington. Just also mildly coincidentally, I was at the UW in the early '70s for a few semesters or quarters, whatever they are, and I did take philosophy of science course while I was there, and it was one of the most impactful courses I've ever taken in my life. I mean, I think there's scarcely a week goes by that I don't think about something in that course. So it is intriguing, and especially for people who like asking questions and digging down and trying to find out, what's I'm not real. I hate to use that word, but something like that. How can we be thinking in a more organized way that's got some relationship to the real world, for lack of a better term. But anyway, so let
Reliable predictions,
yeah, things like that.
evidence-based reasoning.
Yeah, that we're fitting in with our fellow human beings in a way that works. So let's just talk. Let's see if we can apply some of this to climate change. This program is climate talk after all. Um, how can well, I tell you what, start off by telling me what we mean when we say ethics.
Oh, that's such a tricky question. What do we mean? Um, there are several different ways to approach that question. One straightforward way is to just ask, what's a good way to be in the world? Um, and what matters? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to what matters?
Yeah, and so I'm thinking that in all of those uh, very pointed questions, we're not talking only about ourselves, but we're talking about our social institutions, us as a species. What matters to us as species? How do we decide what to do as a species? Is that a fair thing to say?
It is a fair thing to say, and yet it's more than what matters to me. It's not just what do I think is important. The question of ethics challenges us to ask, are there things that just are important, whether
Uh,
I believe it or not, whether I know it or not? And so, what cracked open the field of environmental ethics, at least Western environmental ethics in North America and Europe, was asking this question: is there someone or something that matters morally besides human beings? And
th-
that really started this flourishing of conversation.
Yeah, so that opens up a whole area that I hope we'll have time to talk about because I see in the way I asked the question that I was really asking the question about just people and do we have um, do we have to behave ethically when it comes to trees, rivers, animals is fairly easy. I mean, especially the warm-blooded animals. Yeah, most people say yeah we should treat them ethically, but what about shrimp or ferns? Should we treat them ethically? So we will try to get that downstream. That is a very interesting subject. But for now, um, how do you see conversations within the philosophical, let's say, philosophical academic community? How do you see those conversations or the work that's being done? How can they apply to conversations about the environment in general and climate change in particular? In other words, how do we get
Let
from
me,
academia to the real world, quote unquote?
so I think there's a real place for academia that doesn't necessarily relate to the real world in any obvious way. And that is there's two ways in which that matters. One is that when you are exploring knowledge, you don't know what you're going to find. And you could find the coolest things or you could find something that's useless, right? So um, there are a lot of inventions that when they were first thought of or discovered were considered completely useless that have been revolutionary down the line. But then there's also a place for a kind of rigorous conversation that's well grounded in a certain methodology or a certain paradigm, um, that we have methods for evaluating whether or not there's good research there and having really rigorous conversations about that. Now, those processes aren't perfect. We hear stories about that all the time. Um, but that kind of deep dive into a topic or a question can be a really important grounding for more everyday conversations. Because it's really easy to have an everyday conversation where we just chat about an anecdote or a story I just read or how I feel about things or how I wish things were. But if that's not grounded in some sort of reality, then we don't know that our actions based on these conversations are going to be effective.
So,
And academia can provide an attempt of grounding.
so I guess I'm going back to so I look around at my friends, people I have interactions with, and I don't see them asking these questions of themselves very often. I mean, it's just like everybody's got an opinion, and most people they feel like their opinions are pretty much right, and they're pretty much content with it. So, how does the world of ethics And I see the value just conceptually in digging in, and I mean, it's a little bit like the balance between pure science, just doing science for science's sake, and doing research to create a product for sale or something like that. That's the metaphor I'm kind of seeing with what you said here. So, for ordinary folks, how do these ethical questions show up for them in a way that maybe they're forced to answer them? And in relationship to that, I mean, we have people who deny the reality of science in our culture. I mean, prominent people that deny the reality of science. So, do those people have an ethical basis for what they're saying, or do they believe they do, or can we determine that?
Well, so I hear you asking these ethical conversations that are happening in academia, how are they relevant to
Right.
everyday decision making about climate? Um, there's one really key way, which is that I'd like to see more people engaging in these ethical conversations and
Yeah.
thinking. Um, because we're always making decisions. And are we really thinking through what they mean? So, what my students tell me at the end of the quarter is maybe I haven't necessarily changed my mind about what I think we should do. Maybe I have. But my students tell me I think about it differently. I see it more nuanced. I'm better able to engage with others who have a different point of view and understand where they might be coming from and understand where we might agree or disagree. And so it makes it easier to find points of agreement. So, for example, something I think you've mentioned before on this podcast, which is this question that comes up a lot when addressing climate change: why should the United States take on the huge task of reducing our climate emissions when it's a global problem? And and so that's where philosophers have spent a lot of time debating and talking about this and looking about, well, what does it mean for something to be fair? And if we look at the historical emissions over time, so I like the analogy of a pie, right? So is the United States like someone who's already eaten most of the pie and then sits down and says, well, it isn't fair that I don't have the same slice that everyone else has of this tiny little bit that's left. Um, so when China or India is saying, look, we're going to need to emit some carbon emissions here for a few years in order to bring up a standard of living for our citizens, there's a reasonable place for that. And I think thinking about these questions helps us see why that might be a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm thinking of at the moment is there. It does seem to me like ethical systems. Uh, there's a whole ecosystem of ethical systems. I mean, somebody who lives in India, probably their ethical system is somewhat different from mine, just because of the history of their culture and so on and so forth. So, can we, and I'm also thinking of indigenous people, for instance, uh, who clearly had an ethical system that was proven over time. So, are there things that we can learn from other people's ethical systems, especially, well, cultures that are different than ours and from indigenous people from around the world?
That's a great question. I love that question. So, when we think about environmental ethics, the Western environmental ethics I was trained in that we get from John Muir and Aldo Leopold, there's this awakening of recognition that somebody or something beside human beings matter morally. And there's a tendency in the conversations I hear on the radio and that I read about in the newspaper and that I have with my friends to say, oh gosh, human beings have really messed up and we've got to think about things in a new way. But you mentioned indigenous cultures and indigenous ways of thinking that have been around for thousands of years that predate John Muir and predate Aldo Leopold. And in that way of thinking, people, the word people refers to every living thing. So we have the tree people, we have the bear people. And when I was growing up in Alaska, I thought, did this mean that there were like humans that turned into bears and bears that turned into humans? But maybe it just means a recognition of that inherent value of bears, of salmon, of trees. And once you get that way of seeing the world, right, once you have that paradigm shift, now it opens up a whole new way of talking about development. Should we support cutting down trees to build affordable housing in the neighborhood? Should we let the gas station, that wants to expand, should they be able to do whatever they want with their land, or do we all have a stake in that old growth forest or that new growth forest that they're talking about? And if we start to see the natural world around us not as separate from us, but as people in their own right, you mentioned rivers and forests and species, then it shifts what we think of as acceptable and what we think of as doable. Now it seems totally doable and reasonable to have protections for a forest in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I recognize that kind of evolution in thinking in myself. And one of the interesting things to me is that growing up in our culture, even being educated in our culture, there was so much going on that was invisible to me because it was part of our culture. So like a notion like, well, the world is here and all of its resources is here for us, and let's just go use it. Uh, I mean, that I don't think anybody ever put it to me like that, but that's what I came away with. And I think a lot of our culture still believes the same thing. So it is absolutely an evolution to start thinking, whoa, maybe that's not the way it is. And of course, I think the thing that's making us do that now is because we're in trouble environmentally. There's nothing like a little pain or a problem to get a person or a culture to start saying, well, maybe we should do things a little bit differently. And I think you're kind of talking a little bit about something that we might call rights of nature. Is that is that what we're
It's very
talking
much
about?
connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so fill in some blanks on that. When we talk, and I'll start off just by saying I saw some commentary on a news article recently, on the internet, and the article was about rights of nature. And some commentator said, "Oh yeah, great idea. So now the orcas are going to be suing the salmon." So I think there's some pretty significant resistance and misunderstanding about what rights of nature adds up to. So help us clear that up a little bit.
So I'm going to go in a slightly different direction
Okay,
from that question.
sure.
So there is a place where using words like people can be misleading, um, or rights can be misleading as well, because we don't mean voting rights. We don't, uh, but and we don't necessarily mean equal standing. Um, but there is. I want to return to something you said before, which is that John Locke did explicitly say that here is the land, and here's the water, and here's the food, and it is here for whoever wants to come and take it and do the work, and then it belongs to them and they can do whatever they want with them. Now he has this caveat that says, well, as long as you leave enough for other people. And I think there was in the European and Western tradition, this mindset that there's plenty. The world is so big.
Mm-hmm.
So often I hear people say, you know, this climate change thing is ridiculous, they say, because they can't imagine that human beings could change the weather. We're not that
Mm-hmm.
powerful.
Yeah.
And what I want to say is, well, we're not that powerful when we're alone. But when we work together, humans can do a lot of things,
Yeah.
especially over a very long period of time. And so, in some ways, Locke got it right in saying, well, we need to be careful to not take so much that there won't be enough for others. Now, I think what you mentioned, John, is that now we're taking so much that there isn't even enough for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's concern about clean water getting us through the next few seasons. We've got concerns about the Colorado River drying up, and aquifers, and the snow melt around the Seattle area. Is that going to see us through even just the next couple of years? It's a serious concern. And so when we want to talk about the rights of nature, there there's a way in which you can bring it back around. So the indigenous thinking, the indigenous lessons, for example, in the Suquamish tribe in the Pacific Northwest, are always tied back to we have to respect the sacredness of the salmon, the sacredness of the orca and the river. One, because they matter, but two, because if we don't, we will run out of food. We won't
Mm.
have salmon to eat.
Yeah.
And so there isn't this there's a connection between the science, the culture, and the ethics in the Suquamish tribe that is all oriented towards making sure we have enough as human beings. And that we ensure that we have enough as human beings by recognizing our place and our role in a natural system. And so I find that super inspiring and really hopeful for thinking like, what kind of futures can we create as a community?
Yeah, it is a lot of fun, and it's encouraging to me to, as I worry about the future, to think, wait a minute, we could create a really beautiful future here. There's a line I picked up somewhere once that said, "All great victories are almost great defeats," and so I kind of feel like that's where we are right now. That yeah, we could lose this, but on the other hand, we could create something really beautiful going forward. I just flashed on something about nature. I mean, I think maybe this is just me doing stream of consciousness here, that in our culture we are so materialistic that we have really lost track of, I think you use the term, the sacredness of things, of nature and related. And I've traveled quite a bit in Japan in my life, and of course Shinto is the traditional religion there, and there are over 650,000 sacred things in Shinto, people, places, or whatever. And there are little shrines all over the place. And I would walk by those shrines and I would get the hair on the back of my neck would stand up because there is something here. It wasn't just that somebody decided to put something up there. There was something there. So I think that's one of the beautiful things that could be out there for us is this kind of reconnection with what we call loosely the natural world. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that people who are exposed to the natural world, somebody who goes for a walk in a forest or takes a kayak down a river or something like that, that it's good for them all the way around. So they're so enough on what we're calling rights of nature, or anything else you want to throw in there?
I have so much more to say, but you might want to talk about other things.
Okay, all right. We have about 10 minutes left here. So, one of the things I'm wondering about is making what I would call the tough decisions uh, in our social system, our economy, and so forth. I grew up in Southern Oregon, way South Oregon, down near Medford, Oregon, and that was logging country. And in the summertime, when the trucks could run, um, they would run almost 24 hours a day. I mean, hundreds, even thousands of trucks. Truck drivers would get paid by how many loads they pulled out in a day, and the guys would actually sleep in their trucks while they were waiting for their truck to be loaded, and then bring that load of logs down. And then, of course, environmental concerns started showing up, and those people were angry. Oh my God, they were angry. They're still angry. So when we made, and they were saying things like, okay, let me get this right. There's this little bird that nobody knows what it is. Nobody ever sees it. It doesn't do anything for us. And I'm going to lose my job over this bird. So speaking as an ethicist, what could be said to a person with that perspective?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, first off, I want to say hats off to loggers. I mean, it's an incredibly challenging job
It is. Yeah.
and um, and also very important. We have books, we have paper, we have build houses. I mean, there's so much that our economy and the lives of so many of us depend on that in a lot of ways. And at the same time, in order to be able to do a job that dangerous and challenging, it's got to be part of your identity. It's got to be part of who you are. And so it's really unfair, I feel like, to go to somebody. Well, maybe I don't want to say unfair, but I think it's a challenge to go to someone and say your identity is bad. That's just, nobody wants to hear that. That's just really hard to handle. And then you have on top of that the very real and serious need for to make a livelihood, and to carry on traditions. So it's definitely a challenge. As an ethicist, my my approach is a little different from other ethicists, maybe. I'm always trying to run away from the hard questions and find solutions that work. So yeah, that's a tough one. So let's find something where we don't have to choose between identity and and a thriving ecosystem. Because then on the other side, we also hear, yeah, of course, there's value in the spotted owl, um, but there's also value in the old growth forest itself. And we're only, well, indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest have known for a very long time what that value is, and Western science is only now learning um, the roles that those ecosystems have played in sustaining clean air, clean water, good food, distributing nutrients across the forest, in a way that can sustain all life, including human life. And so, if we just pit a logger's job against a spotted owl, it's really tough. But when we when we look at a conflict between a whole community's thriving and identity and an important part of a natural system that helps all of us survive and live, then we start to say, well, these are both really important. Maybe we can move through this. So, the Nature Conservancy, for example, has been pioneering sustainable logging practices, and it's kind of a pivot. And so, I always think it's funny that, not the haha kind, that when a business goes under because they had a bad business model, or so for example, Blockbuster went out of business because we had internet streaming, we had Netflix, right? Well, that was too bad for Blockbuster, right? Their business just didn't match the market. But when we have a business that doesn't match the market because it's damaging the market, because it's actually causing more problems than it's solving, I feel like we should have the same response. Wow, that's too bad that business didn't work out, but I really hope that they can pivot to something that the market actually needs. And so we do need a way to resource uh, uh, books and housing and everything. That's definitely needed. How can we do that doesn't endanger species in old growth forests?
Yeah, so that's good. I picked up something listening to you, just in myself, because I realized that I have tended to. This is going to be an oversimplification, but I've tended to be something like the loggers and the spotted owl thing. I've tended to like logger bad, spotted owl good, and that and sort of like end of story. And listening to you, I could tell how much different it would be in talking to that logger to say something like, I know this is a part of you, and what you did, what you were able to do was special. I mean, it was hard, it was dangerous. You did it, and because you did it, we have houses and we have paper and books and things like that. And so all of a sudden, it seems like that might open up the door for conversation a little bit. Whereas, lager, lager bad, spotted owl good is probably destined to failure. I do think there might be a little parallel with that with the fossil fuel industry, because I tend to do the same thing with the fossil fuel industry. And I've heard speakers say things like, well, they are grateful for all of the things that the fossil fuel industry has given us over time. And the reality is that the blessings are bountiful. I mean, even just talking about medical advances could be just one simple example that wouldn't have been possible without all of that energy. So you're kind of, whether intended or not, kind of pointing a more nuanced way of looking at these kinds of possibly very partisan issues than I have, that I acknowledge that I'm not always that good at doing what we're talking about here. So we are getting close to the end. I want to ask you, I'm not sure where this fits in as a philosophical question, but I think it does. And that is, uh, people are constantly asking me and others, well, what can I do? So, what should we do?
I can talk about that for another half hour. I love that question because it's so troubling. I mean, it wakes me up at night. I spend so much time thinking about what can I do. And step one, I think for me, has been to reframe it as what can we do? None of us caused this problem alone, and we're not going to solve it alone. So we got to work together to find solutions. So what can we do? We can find each other. We can talk to each other. And I think uh, recognize also that what we do in our own individual lives, in our homes, in our transportation is important, but it's not going to be enough, right? So we're living in systems. We're very stuck in them, and they encompass everything we do. So for the person who knows I need to drive less, that's true, and I also need to get my kid to school in the morning, and I also need to get to work, and I need to get to the store. How am I going to do that? So if we think about me as an individual, that's really hard. But when we think about us as a community, then we can start to see solutions. So maybe the way I need to get my kid to school in the morning is to fund more bus drivers, and to
Mm-hmm.
get them better job security, to support my local government building bike paths, um, and to support local public transit. And so these are things I can't do. I can't go out and build a bike path,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But together with my neighborhood and my community and my local representatives, we can talk about safe routes to school, safe routes to work. So I like to think about what is my sphere of influence. So is it going to be my local government? Is it going to be where I work? So I think we've all seen in the last year in 2020 that there's just been a complete opening up of possibilities of being able to work from home,
Mm-hmm.
being able to communicate with colleagues around the world without having to get on a plane to fly to them. Right now, I'm struggling with some big conferences in philosophy, trying to encourage them to support more virtual participation. And people are having a hard time getting their head around meeting virtually, and why that would be worth it. It's not perfect, but we're at the point in time where we have to do things that are doable but not perfect. We are
Yeah.
out of time, in terms of emitting fossil fuels. We got to get this done now. And so I invite people to think about what's within your sphere of influence and who's in your community. What can you do together?
Yeah, I think that's really, really sound advice. I don't know who came up with it, but I do have some stuff that I have control over in terms of my contribution to carbon dioxide. And so it is what I value paying attention to those for myself. Um, part of the value that I find in that is that it makes me more aware by doing that. It makes me aware of the challenges of not having methane gas in my house or something like that, which also makes me more sympathetic to other people's challenges with this stuff. But as you say, that's just a part of it. And really, to get from here to there, we really do need to join with other people to. And as you've pointed out earlier, the critical part of I think there's two parts of listening to other people and not creating them as the opposition or something like that. It's real easy for me to think, well, they're the opposition, but maybe they probably think I'm the opposition too. So somebody's got to wave the first olive branch. So we are darn near out of time. I want to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation. I loved going to college. Uh, some people would say the evidence of that is that it took me 17 years to get through college to get my undergraduate degree, but I loved it. And just listening to you just reminds me of how wonderful it is for open minds to be exploring and sharing ideas, and to be for awarenesses that didn't exist before to be opening up. I'm sure you as a professor sometimes see the light go on in a student's face, and whatever other travails you have to deal with it, it's value, it's all worth it at that moment. So uh,
Definitely.
up to you. Finish up here. Anything else that you want to throw in before we finish the day here?
I did want to throw in two things,
Okay,
if I may.
please do.
One is don't underestimate the role of the arts.
Hmm.
Videos, movies, stories, books. If you've got something to say it. Music,
Hmm.
because that is how we imagine what's possible. And we need imagination and creativity now more than ever to help us envision a positive future. And then the other thing that I wanted to do is much more grounded, which is as you're looking at solutions in your community, just keep in mind this really key distinction. Is this solution going to reduce climate emissions and reduce the potential harm of climate change um, for the long term? Or is this solution going to help us adapt to the challenges of climate change?
Hmm.
So there's jargon for that. Is it mitigation or is it adaptation? Now, something could be both. It could be one or the other. Sometimes they're in conflict. And so, for example, when we think about, oh, it's been really hot in the Pacific Northwest, should I get an air conditioner? That's a way to adapt to new
Hmm.
conditions, but it's actually going to make climate change way, way, way worse. So, what do I do? Right? Well, maybe you can get a heat pump, which will cool the house, cool your house on those few hot days. And yet in the winter, be way much more fuel efficient and could actually both help us adapt and mitigate climate change in the long run. So both of these are super important, but one reducing climate emissions now is something that we have. It's urgently has to be done right now. We're on a deadline, and the effects of that will be irreversible for a very long time, for hundreds of years, if not more, and could be quite devastating. And so I tend to prioritize actions that are going to mitigate climate change and reduce climate emissions now. But I understand that adapting is also super important.
Yeah. So one of the key things I'm hearing there is the call to be really, really thoughtful about the steps we take. What are the short, medium, and long term consequences or benefits from what I'm about to do here? I heard somebody once saying something like they wanted somebody to give this important subject as much thought as they would give to deciding to buy a new refrigerator, because we do tend to be just with our normal routine in our lives, the way they've developed, to just take those for granted and don't think much about anything else. And it does require effort and intention, I think, to think about some of these things. And I do think that those of us who are concerned can drop um, thoughtful comments here and there, like, "Oh, well, what's the energy rating of that new refrigerator you're thinking about?" Or, "Yeah, it was hot. So, have you thought about putting in a heat pump or something like that?" So, a
Definitely.
big,
And when we talk about a climate related issue, to ask ourselves, is that going to reduce the harms of climate change in the long run? Is that going to mitigate and reduce climate emissions so that climate change isn't so harmful to us in the long
yeah.
run? Have that question in the back of our minds.
Yeah, and for me, there's a little thing in here. It's almost like, Easter egg hunt comes to mind. I mean, it's become somewhat of a hobby of mine to think about my behavior and those who I care about, their behavior, and what the meanings of those behaviors are. And so, full disclosure, the only methane thing I've got in my house is my range, and I'm right now in the process of figuring out how to cook without that range and I'm very, very close. I mean, it's just a matter of a couple, 3 weeks, and I'm going to be done. And I'm going to call up PGE, or not PGE, that's California, PSE, and tell them, hey, come out and turn off my gas.
Oh, fantastic.
I know, and it's like I'm getting personal fun out of the project of doing that. So
And it's a good role model for all of us to see what can be done, what's possible.
I do see. I'm not much of a proselytizer. In fact, I'm terrible at that. But I do see that my behavior influences other people without me ever saying a word. So I get that. Well, you've made a couple comments about, well, you could talk about this or that for half an hour, and clearly we could talk for a long time. I've loved this conversation. I really appreciate, once again, you taking the time to be with us, and maybe we can pick up some of those other conversation branches at some future time and flesh those out as well. So anyway, thanks so
Absolutely.
much. Okay,
Delighted to be here. Thank you so
thanks.
much.